Good evening and welcome. My name is Gayatri Patnaik, and I'm Associate Director and Editorial Director of Beacon Press. It's an honor for me to introduce Tom DeWolf and Sharon Morgan. I was fortunate enough to be their editor for their book that Beacon published in 2012 called Gather at the Table, The Healing Journey of a Daughter of Slavery and a Son of the Slave Trade. I met Tom a few years before Sharon because I published his first book in 2008, which was called Inheriting the Trade. In 2001, Tom found out something that proved life-changing. It was related to the largest slave-trading dynasty in U.S. history, who transported at least 10,000 Africans here. His memoir documents the journey in which he and 9 of his family members both confront their legacy and also trace their ancestors' steps through the Triangle trade route, from New England to West Africa to Cuba, and they grapple with their history. Gather at the Table was a different kind of journey. It's the journey of a Black man, Black woman, and white man confronting the legacy of slavery and racism head-on. Over 3 years, Sharon and Tom traveled thousands of miles through 27 states and also abroad, visiting ancestral towns, courthouses, cemeteries, plantations, antebellum mansions, and historic sites. I was struck by their joint commitment to doing the hard work and making the deliberate decision to enter into conversations that would be awkward, challenging, enraging, and perhaps ultimately life-changing. But more than conversations, they entered each other's lives, spending time with one another's families and friends, and engaged in deep conversations about how the lingering trauma of slavery shaped their lives. In the last few weeks, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, I found myself thinking of Sharon and Tom's journey and their commitment to having the tough conversations. And I can't help but feel that they have something to offer us in these times. Sharon and Tom will each speak for a few minutes. After that, we'll have a little time for questions. So if you have any, please do type those into the Q&A box. And please help me welcome Sharon and Tom.
Thank you. I came to Gather at the Table because of my work as a genealogist. And I have spent most of my life researching my family history. I found out when I was a relatively young adult that a woman who I met when I was a small child, who was my father's grandmother, had been enslaved. She was alive when I was a child. It really impressed me that people say you should just get over slavery. And what hit me is that slavery lived in my lifetime because she lived. Her name was Rhoda Leslie. And it fueled my passion for being able to continue to do the research. So I researched my father's family, then I researched my mother's family, and that also ended up being incredibly productive because I found out that my great-grandmother, my 2 times great-grandmother, had 17 children with the nephew of the man who owned her, and that she was sold as a 9-year-old child away from her mother and grandmother. Everywhere I looked, there was so much horror. And my family is not unique. This is true of many people. 4 million people were emancipated after the Civil War. So there are millions of people living today that can share some version of this story. But it made me incredibly angry because I was not able to understand how people could be so evil and do so many awful things to other human beings. The most evil thing being dehumanizing them and taking away their humanity. I mean, the essence of themselves and their ability to control their lives. So in the process of trying to figure out how to come to terms with that, I discovered something called Coming to the Table, which is an effort to link people who were the descendants of people who were enslaved with the descendants of people whose families had enslaved them. And I was very resistant to that idea at first. But I was convinced to go to Eastern Mennonite University, which was another thing that I couldn't figure out because I didn't know what Mennonites were. And I thought I would go to this place where everybody had on long dresses and those little bonnets, and they were driving horse and buggy. That ended up not being true. I met Tom. I met some incredible people, black and white, who were so committed to a mission of making peace out of this travesty that we have experienced. And what I learned there was a model for healing. And Tom suggested we should live out this model. And then later it's like, oh, we should write a book about it because we're going to see if this model works. Because it's all intellectual at that point. And I didn't like Tom at that point. He was Mr. Picture Perfect white guy. So, but I agreed because my soul needed healing. I needed something. So we did this journey. We figured out how to take this model and live it and see what would happen. And it easily could have ended up very badly, but it did not. We wanted to have opposing points. So black woman, white man, at that time I'm urban, he's rural. There were many things that were oppositional about it. And if we could get through all of that, and if this model could work, that would be an awesome thing, like for the world. So that is how Gather at the Table came to be. And I'm very glad that it came to be because it has made me a much stronger, less angry, but more determined person. Because I have to take that accumulated horror over centuries and process that in some kind of way. So Gather at the Table helped me to do that, so that at this point, I have moved to Mississippi where my ancestors came from. I now live on the street where my enslaved ancestors lived. I am 10 miles from the plantation where she was enslaved. And it is another profound experience because I have gathered at the table in a whole nother, in a really up close and visceral way. The trying times that we're living in now also anger and disturb me. But I feel like there must be enough good people, good-hearted people in this world. Whether or not they know what to do is one thing. But I must believe that there are enough people that are willing to engage a process so that we can overcome the legacy of slavery, the racism that ensued because of that, and the atrocities that are going on today, so that we can heal and make a better society. So that's my story. Tom?
I love listening to you talk and introduce how this evolved with you. We came to the table from pretty different perspectives. I didn't know any of my family history growing up. My grandfather died when my dad was 2 years old, so there was nobody, if he even knew these stories, there was nobody to pass them along. So it was my late 40s before I learned about this, and then went off to make the film and write my first book. And you just learn all of this horror. Standing in a dungeon at a slave castle on the coast of Ghana and imagining what it's like to be stolen from your family, with them not knowing if you're alive or dead, you not knowing if they're alive or dead, and then you're, you know, in this dungeon for however many weeks at a time, and just horrible, inhumane conditions before being put into the hold of a ship for a month's long journey across the Atlantic Ocean, to then be enslaved and have your children and grandchildren be enslaved forever. It was just like the horror of it all was all new to me. And that's the way it's designed. I mean, white supremacy is designed for people like me not to know this stuff, not to know this history, because it serves the system well for me not to know it and to help perpetuate the system as it exists. And so like you get home from this amazing journey of retracing the triangle trade and really learning and grappling for the first, I mean, I grew up in the 60s, and I mean, I read Eldridge Cleaver, I read Dick Gregory, I grew up in Southern California, you know, 20 miles from the Watts riots. It's not like I didn't know about racism and certain aspects of the legacy of slavery, but I, you know, truly had no clue of the direct connection to my family, but really the complete involvement of every aspect of this country's existence, and every aspect of the world's economy was based in slavery. And learning that, the overwhelmingness of all of that, what do you do next? And then getting invited to this little gathering at this little Mennonite school. And like Sharon, I didn't really know, I'd heard the word Mennonite, but I didn't know what that, you know, I didn't know anything about that particular faith tradition before coming to EMU for this first weekend of, you know, a couple dozen people gathering to study together, spend a weekend contemplating historical trauma and its transgenerational transmission, to study restorative justice, circle process, conflict resolution. It was just an incredible weekend back in 2006. And then nothing happened for a couple of years until there was a week-long class about the coming to the table approach. And that's where Sharon and I met. And like she said, we didn't really connect that weekend. But some months later, I was speaking in the town, her hometown of Chicago. And she came to the University of Chicago where I was speaking just to give me a hug. She couldn't actually stay. And that moment was the beginning of our relationship, that she would make that effort to come and connect. And then out of this, it's like this approach, this coming to the table approach of looking at racial healing with a particular lens of anti-oppression, anti-racism. And you know, there's 4 pillars to this approach of understanding, acknowledging, exploring, exposing all of history, the good parts and the really horrible, troubling parts, to the building of relationships, authentic, accountable relationships within and across racial lines, to work towards healing by any means necessary, whether that's, you know, through your faith tradition, through meditation, yoga, apology, reparation, all forms of healing these wounds. And then taking action is the 4th pillar to undo these systems of oppression. And, you know, we've gone from a couple dozen people back in 2006 to where now there's, gosh, we've added 500 new members in the last 30 days. We've gone, before the last presidential election, there were 10 local affiliate groups around the country. There's now 42 in 16 different states. There's like 5,000 subscribers to our monthly newsletter, 5,000 members of the very active Facebook group. And so deciding with Sharon to live this approach to racial healing, at the time, it just felt like it's really important to spread information as widely as possible about this approach. And, you know, to have Beacon Press and Gayatri embrace this idea so warmly, to publish this book was just huge. And to be in a situation where, yeah, you know, I've spent many nights in Sharon's home as she has in mine. We've met each other's families. You know, we've become really close friends. And it's the only way for, I will speak as a white male, in order to understand, to begin to understand the kind of pain and horror and trauma that Sharon describes, is to be proximate with it, to be connected. And that happens in relationship. And within those relationships, the sharing of stories that we have shared with each other, learning what each other's musical tastes are, what foods we like, you know, how we can be in a car together with just Sharon and me and her little dog for, you know, a month, traveling around, visiting, you know, 24 different states across this country, visiting these sites of racial terror, of civil rights hope, and really being proximate with each other as we explore these spaces together. It's really what this all boils down to, is having the courage to learn to get past our feelings of guilt and shame and get to this space where we're committed to understanding this legacy of slavery in this country. And if there's a silver lining to the current Republican administration and all the racism and racialized craziness that's taking place in our nation, that's being exacerbated by the president and many others within the administration, the silver lining is there's a whole lot of people of European descent who are recognizing for the first time, as I did in my late 40s, that this did not go away with the I Have a Dream speech in 1963. You know, when Dr. King talks about the arc of the moral universe being long, it's really long. But taking faith that it bends towards justice gives me the hope that what we're experiencing right now is a really bad chapter in a very long book. And I hope and I believe that when we get to the end, it's going to be, and they lived happily ever after, the end. But without the work that we're committed to doing through coming to the table, and many other organizations doing really fine work, the kinds of books that are being published. The New York Times bestseller list is just what a dream right now to see the books that are at the top of that list right now. It does give me hope in these really challenging days. And I'll pause there as well.
One thing that impresses me is that we are seeing activism that is very similar to what happened during the civil rights movement in which both Tom and I grew up. The fact that everybody is in the street, everybody is having a voice. Black, white, Asian, Latino, I mean, it's like everybody's out there. And that really means a lot, because this problem is never going to be solved unless everyone invests in making it be solved, And white people invest in changing their behavior so that the white superiority is no longer the law of the land. We are a diverse society, whether people like that or not. And everyone needs to be treated with respect. And we need to live in an equitable society where everyone is treated as equal. And it really makes me feel good to see young people doing this and engaging that mission. Some of the things that stood out for me when Tom and I went on the road, part of the idea was to have two opposing people be at the same place at the same time, looking at the same thing, and then talking about our feelings. So when Tom said he didn't know anything about his ancestors, and then we go to a farm in, where was that, in Kentucky, in Gamaliel, Kentucky.
Yeah.
And he knew the building was locked, and Tom went to ask somebody how to get into this building and ended up being related to the person in the bank that told him how to get into the building. And we had instances like that where he got put in touch with his ancestry. And then we realized that I have an ancestor who blew his head off with a shotgun. And he had an ancestor who had done the same thing. So you find these points of commonality, and you find these points of intersection that we don't normally know that we have unless you engage a relationship like this. When we were in Tobago, and we're staying in a great house, and you walk in the door and there's a list of people who were enslaved there. And then how does that make you feel, you know, that this is where we're going to sleep? Same thing happens in Natchez. We go to stay at this place that was the picture for Gone with the Wind, the Gone with the Wind movie. And talking to the woman who owned it and, you know, dissecting the things that she said, there were thousands of experiences that we had that really brought to the forefront that there were differences. There were significant differences sometimes. There were arguments sometimes. But there was a commonality, a universal commonality of two people who really want an answer and two people who really want for things to change. And by us being able to build our relationship against all odds is a model so other people don't have to travel 3,000 miles in 30 days or 6,000, however, I've lost track with a dog. So it was totally illuminating and different for me. I mean, I live in a world where, of course, I know white people. Of course, I mean, you have to work with, I don't want this to sound condescending, but you have to work with them and you have to have some relationship. But that relationship had always been very limited, and I could always be rescued because I could leave. And this was one where I couldn't leave. So I'm stuck in this car with this white man I don't know at the beginning. And there were days when it's like, I wanted to say, get out of the car. Cause I don't want to, you know, I got scared when we were in California because he drove me up in the country to go to his sister's house. And it's like, how I don't trust you. How do I get out of here? Because I have to be paranoid because that's how Black people live. So, you know, going through all of that was truly revealing. And I cannot tell you the button that got pushed, but there was this moment when it was kind of like, oh, okay, this is what I do with that anger. I challenge it. I challenge myself to channel it into something positive. So I focused on building our Black ancestry, and we now have 35,000 members of people who are doing the same thing that I did. They want to know their family history and do the same thing that I've done.
You know, the thing that you remind me of, Sharon, is just the importance of showing up. And there's a lot of what's happening in this particular moment right now is, I mean, you know, you've been here in the town where I live in Central Oregon. It's, you know, 95% people of European descent. You know,
That's a big step, because when I was there, I statistically changed the population.
you did indeed, and it's like, I mean, and Oregon is one of these states that is white on purpose. I mean, it was written into the state constitution that Black people, free or enslaved, were not allowed to live here. And culturally, that has resulted in this state being one of the whitest states in the country. And we're having Black Lives Matter marches in this little town of, you know, almost all white people. But we're starting to see this happen now, the kind of boycotts that are taking place, the kinds of results and elections that are taking place, the Washington Redskins changing their name from the racist, long racist history of the name of their mascot.
Macon, Mississippi is trying to relocate the Confederate statue. And a white person asked for that to happen.
Wow.
It was like, whoa!
And Asheville, North Carolina, the city council just yesterday voted unanimously for reparations. I mean, we're seeing things move in ways that, you know, when I start seeing people like Ta-Nehisi Coates say that he has hope for change, it's like, okay, maybe there really is. I just, if ever there was a moment, and yes, it felt like it in the 60s with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and we've seen those things get picked apart. You know, end of slavery gets replaced by Jim Crow. Jim Crow gets replaced by the prison industrial complex that targets Black and brown bodies. Maybe, just maybe, we're at a moment where there are enough people that, and I will put this on the shoulders of white people, because white people created racism for their own financial benefit. And it is incumbent upon white people to undo racism by any means necessary. And so for white people to step up and make these kinds of changes, some because they're pressured as business owners, but many because they're learning things that they weren't taught in school, because this stuff is not in our history books. And, you know, thank God for Beacon Press. It's starting to show up in our books in ubiquitous ways. But maybe we're at that tipping point where there are enough people that it really does begin to shift ideas about reparation, about apology, about you know, the kinds of shifts in banking practices, in real estate practices, in education, healthcare, and particularly when it comes to the police and police killings and the criminal justice system in general, building in, for the first time in our nation's history, the kind of equity and justice that was talked about when the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were first written.
And remember, we went to Occupy Wall Street?
Yeah.
And this feels totally different than that. It's like, this feels like a truly pivotal moment. So I am really happy to see that.
You know, Sharon, and one of the things that I explore in my mind is the sort of the parallel universes of the rising up right now of recognition about racism, Black Lives Matter, police violence against Black bodies with the coronavirus pandemic. It's almost like Mother Nature or God or the universe is saying, okay, people, you go into the corner for a timeout. You need to think about what you've done. And it's given us this opportunity to read more books, to watch more movies, to have more conversations like this that we haven't had in this country before on this broad of a scale. You're absolutely right.
There are mornings when I wake up and I fully expect to see the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse riding down Fifth Avenue.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm really hoping this is it.
Yeah.
So I see that we have 7 questions. So I think maybe in order to use our time wisely, we might want to go to those questions.
I completely agree. Sharon, the first one is for you. Sharon, did your family talk about the ancestral story of the slave experience?
No. What happened is that my father absolutely would not talk about it because he felt like my desire, I was an Africanist. I mean, I was very, very rebellious about everything I'd grown up with. And he said, you just want to go back to Africa. And yes, I did. So he wouldn't talk to me for a really long time. And when he finally started talking to me and told me that the person that I met when I was a small child had been enslaved, that was like an incredible moment. And then he started telling me the story of their lives. So how they came off the plantation, who came off the plantation with them, where they went to live, and he gave me a lot of information. My mother was more forthcoming, but there was a family myth that our ancestress was an Indian woman. And she had all these children with this white man, but the word slavery was never mentioned. And so it was very revealing to her when I was able to tell her that we did a DNA test, there is no Indian. She was enslaved. I can tell you she was sold when she was 9 years old. And I can tell you everything about the man who fathered her children and his family. And it ended up being helpful to them as well as the rest of my family, who were disinterested for many years. But then they get really excited when I would come back home, like in Thanksgiving dinner. It's like, okay, let me pull out my map and I'll show you the story. And then they got really into it. So now it's a totally different picture. But no.
Okay, Tom, the next question is for you. Tom, how did you find out about your family's involvement in the slave trade?
You know, it's interesting. I've heard Sharon express what she just expressed many times, and we both grew up in families that didn't talk about this history, wasn't taught in the schools, churches, what have you, and so I didn't know anything. And it was in the year 2000, so I was 46 years old, when a friend of mine here where I live, we also discovered back in the 80s that we are distant cousins. And his father did the genealogy that showed that Dave and I were sixth cousins once removed. And he actually got invited to participate in this journey of discovery. I did not. He was the one who shared with me the invitation, and I got in touch with the person who was making the film. And that was how I found out, was because of the making of this film, and then the writing of Inheriting the Trade. I mean, I was raised in, I think, a typical Southern California, European American family, that we respect everybody, we don't discriminate, we're nice people, we're, you know, supportive of everybody's rights. The trouble is that that's where it ends, is a lot of talk. But when it comes time for dealing with issues of the legacy of slavery, and it gets a lot more difficult, the conversations, people tend to build those walls of protection around them. And I certainly did. I mean, I was just a scared little white kid when there's police in full riot gear on my junior high school campus because of the race riots, and, you know, get put into a private Christian high school where it's almost all white kids, and completely removed from that racial unrest that I faced in the public schools, and then moved to Oregon. So, you know, for me, that discovery came completely not through family knowledge of my birth family, but family knowledge through these distant relatives who were directly related to the slave traders. You're muted.
Gayatri, you're muted.
Sorry about that. How do each of you feel about the government doing some type of reparations for descendants whose ancestors were enslaved?
I absolutely feel like there should be reparations, but I feel that they do not have to take the form that people immediately think about, which is write me a check, because if you write a check, you're absconding. You're not really engaging the process. So I think that it takes many forms. What the best form would be is investing money in repairing the damage, not as much to individuals as to people on a societal level. So there should be scholarships, there should be changes in mortgage lending, there should be things like that that give economic benefit to individuals, but not necessarily in the form of a check. And I would urge the House Bill 40, which was presented by Congressman John Conyers for years and years and years and years and never got any consideration. The U.S. government has even not wanted to look at the possibility of researching what needs to be repaired. So I think that is actually a first step toward reparation, which is looking at what happened, what needs to be repaired, and how much would that be worth? How much should be invested in that?
I'd write the checks if I would support writing the checks to individuals. I look at the wealth in this nation and the disparity of wealth and how much more wealth white families own, control compared to African descended families. I mean, you look at the GI Bill at the end of World War II that was supposed to support GIs coming home. Well, 98% of that money went to white GIs who then built the all-white suburbs, left the cities, and our schools are funded by property taxes. So these all-white suburbs, with all of their higher property values, build these really nice schools, and the schools in the inner cities suffer as a result. So we've got 10 or 15 times the wealth that white folks have over black folks. And Coming to the Table has a reparations working group. We've got like a 22, 23-page document on a reparations guide on what individuals and what groups can do in terms of history, healing, connecting, and action. It's a wonderful document that's available on the website under working groups, comingtothetable.org. People would find the reparations working group, and the guide is available in there. And I agree with Sharon, scholarships and what have you. I just watched a documentary about Asbury Park, New Jersey, and how 50 years ago this month, race riots just decimated this town that was, famous for its music primarily. And over the 5 decades since then, all the repair has been done on the east side of the tracks where all the white people live. On the west side of the tracks where black folks and Italian folks, people of color have lived, it's still just devastated. And that happens that way throughout the United States, where there's always support for people who look like me. And so, I look at the parallels right now, what Congress provided, the additional $600 per week in unemployment because people have lost their jobs. Well, this to me is much longer history of people being discriminated against, and providing direct financial support to people of color, to black folks in particular. Legacy of slavery is a perfectly reasonable approach to dealing with the economic disparity that has been set up within the systems of this country. It doesn't take away from me that this is the white people's biggest fear. Reparations, the word strikes fear into so many white people. What we're talking about is repair. We've we've created a breach. That's what it talks about in the Christian Bible, is the breach, and repairing the breach, the brokenness that we have created since the founding of this nation. And it's going to take money, it's going to take effort, it's going to take change. And not always easy, but how can we imagine a difference in this world where we look at repair for the sake of repair, not repair for how is it gonna, what's in it for me, or what's gonna cause me and my family harm. Get past that living in fear, and imagine the better world that we all know is possible when we create a world that is more equitable financially, educationally, justice-wise.
Thank you. Here's a longer question, and a very interesting one. It always impresses me how white friends / family / colleagues forget or ignore that most Black Americans have ancestors who have been on North American soil for 2 to 4 centuries, a lot longer than most white people, including me. Sharon and/or Tom, when you hear people say things that indicate they don't accept Black Americans as fully American, what do you say? How do you shake them by the lapels to see? Are you polite, blunt, generous, all three?
I'm usually blunt. Tom is usually more polite and generous. There is no question for me. And there are things that I am unable to entertain and argue about, because anyone who would ask those questions, I can't deal with it. Okay, so maybe that is a shortcoming of mine, but I feel very confirmed about certain things, and there are many things that I will not argue about. So when Tom and I are doing a speaking engagement together, there are times when I deflect to him because it is better, because you will answer it kindly.
You know, the thing that I have always appreciated about working with Sharon, particularly in person or in situations like this, is there are people who will listen to me and hear me because I'm a white man, and they are used to that. There are people who will listen just to Sharon because she's a Black woman, and that is where their comfort level is. And so having us together, it's like we have our friends and family listen to the quote other side, I think in new ways. And yeah, Sharon, you know, rightfully accuses me of being Mr. Kumbaya. And I take that not as a negative thing. For me, I truly want to keep white people in the room. I don't want to shame and blame and toss white people under the bus. The fact is, you know, every white person is descended from a wide variety of people, and those people and us have benefited from the system of enslavement and racial disparity for centuries and centuries. And, you know, I've had a lot of white folks say, I'm glad I'm not you. I'm glad I'm not related the way you are. And my instant response is, do you suppose that your ancestors wore cotton clothing, smoked tobacco, drank coffee or tea with sugar, or indigo clothing? You know, everything about the world was built on a slave-based economy, and it impacted virtually everyone alive on the planet and continues to do so today. I don't argue with people on Facebook, for instance. It's just fruitless.
Pointless.
But I will engage in conversation with people about these issues, because I think that, like it or not, there are people who will hear me because of the fact that I've written books, the fact that I do public speaking, that I'm, you know, the manager of the Coming to the Table program. that there are people who will hear my words and that may make an impact. So I feel a responsibility and obligation to speak out honestly. But oh my goodness, some of the ignorance out there is just like, here, read this book, watch this movie, come back to me after you've done a little bit of homework, rather than just watching some meme or some tweet that somebody has splashed out there that's just absurd.
Sharon, here's a question for you. Sharon, you've talked about your anger and channeling it. Well-meaning white people have been admonishing Black Americans, especially female Black Americans, to curb their anger for many, many years. Are we approaching a time when white people might be willing and able to hear and see the anger and the reasons behind it, maybe even solicit those angry statements?
I think that there's this meme about the angry Black woman, which Michelle Obama got accused of a lot. And what I think about that is that I am entitled to my anger. I'm entitled to feel however I want to feel. And when I look at what happened, anybody would be angry. I mean, it's like, it is not, there's nothing wrong about that. There would be something wrong if I didn't feel angry. And the point is that you have to work that through so that you can use your anger in a productive way. So that's really what I try to do. And I think some of the exercises that we've had with coming to the table and with the STAR model, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, is being able to understand your anger, where it comes from, how you articulate it, and how you can use that to motivate you to do something that is productive and positive. And there have, in the journey in Write and Gather at the Table, there were times when I was so incredibly angry, I would start crying, or I didn't want to have any communication with Tom. And what was really nice about him was that there were times when he's like, okay, cool. And he would just shut up. And then, you know, a little while later, I feel a little better. He's like, are you okay? And it's like, I'm fine. We can go forward so I can get angry again. So it's not the anger. There's nothing wrong with feeling anger. There's nothing wrong with feeling sad. Those are normal human feelings, and you are entitled to feel them. It is how you work those things through so that they become fuel for something positive rather than fuel for something that is self-destructive or negative for the community.
Another question. I appreciate you both and thank you for the work you've done and are doing. At what point in your research and travels together did you begin to really trust each other and become friends?
No.
You know, it grew as all relationships do. And there are so many amazing moments that we shared together. And I would tell you share one moment that it felt like a real turning point to me. We were in a hotel in, I think it was Mississippi or Alabama. It was
Mississippi.
Mississippi, so way up. And we got into an argument where we were this close to being in that space where you're going to say things you're really going to regret. But we were both just, I think we were tired, we were pissed, we had driven thousands of miles, and we just both kind of dug our heels in about whatever we were arguing about, and we both stopped and we looked at each other and recognized the moment that we were in. We can either choose to really get into it with each other, or we can take a deep breath and step back. And we did that. And we went to our separate hotel rooms, spent our night sleeping, pondering, whatever. And then the next morning, it's like we had taken that breath, and it shifted the way that we were in life with each other. And there have been many such moments where there's been tears and rage. And I'm with Sharon. You know, we've got plenty to be angry about, and particularly people in Sharon's position have plenty to be express rage over treatment of families for centuries. But the requirement of a successful and healthy relationship is finding ways to support each other through the really difficult times. And we got there with each other. And that's part of this coming to the table approach, is how to get to this kind of space with people that are really different from you, and work through issues in ways that can build each other up, support each other, even when it's difficult. And it doesn't always work. I mean, as Sharon expressed right at the beginning, this may not have worked. It could have exploded and we didn't get along at all, and none of this ever would have happened. But the commitment to live this particular approach was a very real commitment, and we stuck with it and stuck with each other in ways that even through the tears and the anger, we were able to support each other in our full humanity. And that's, I think, one of the core issues here, is how do we support each other with all of our flaws, the mistakes, the pain we cause, with our words, with our actions. How can we create the kinds of spaces with each other where trust gets built, where relationships become not only meaningful, but long-lasting, and accountable and authentic, not based on who's your favorite sports team or whatever, but based on supporting each other in our lives, in our humanity.
We probably have time for just one or two more questions. Is there an undue burden on people of color to manage experiences of racism for others? If so, how does such an approach mitigate the personal responsibility of those who benefit from racial privilege?
Yeah, I think white people often try to make us responsible. It starts with something that we talked about at the beginning of our journey, which is, don't adopt me as your Black friend, because that is so condescending and paternalistic that really doesn't work. We have to see how this is going to work, because we didn't enter saying, you know, we're going to be really good friends. We're going to work out this model. And we ended up being friends. And that's a very large difference. But I feel frequently there are people in my life who try to make me responsible for them being able to progress, and to lean on me in ways that I think are very unfair, and to ask me to do things and participate in their lives in ways that I don't feel comfortable with. So I don't do it. So yes, I mean, it's like a lot of this belongs to, this burden is not mine. My ancestors carried the burden. Now it's on you. It's like white people really have to pick up the box and carry it. I won't go on.
You know, I remember reading Patricia Raybon, who lives in Colorado, African-American woman, wrote a book called My First White Friend. And that book was a real eye-opener for me. It's how she spent most of her life in proximity with white people in her work life. And you know, she's a Black woman in a mostly white area, and she was nice, and she was pleasant, and she was polite, and she hated white people, but they wouldn't know it. And it really gave me pause to think how much stuff is not only am I ignorant about, but is being hidden from me out of the self-protection necessary for Black folks, for their very lives, for their safety, for their sanity, for their mental and physical health. And that kind of burden should not be on Sharon or people of color any more than it should be on women to help men figure out why we've been such idiots in this patriarchal system forever and ever. The parallels between sexism and racism are deep, and so I look at how Black people have taken care of white people from, not only building this country, but raising white children at the expense of their own families. And now white people want Black people to teach us about our racism. Read the books they've written, but don't go making Sharon your first Black friend.
Yeah, because she won't do it.
Because she won't do it. It's like Sharon and I have worked long and hard to build up the relationship that we have. And I really try not to be that kind of a burden on her. I have my work to do, and I can learn from white folks. I can learn from Black authors. I can watch the films. If I could have every white person in America watch I Am Not Your Negro, it would literally change the world if people approached I Am Not Your Negro with an open mind. If people read Gather at the Table and really understand what Sharon and I went through and continue to go through, it would change their lives. Because it would pull off the blinders. This whole thing, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I saw the world like a child. When I grew up, I put away childish things. Get the blinders off. It's like a horse. So many white people are walking like that horse with the blinders on the side so we can see this way forward. There's all kinds of stuff over here, but we can't see it because we've got these things on. So it's my responsibility to learn, to change, and then to be an agent of change in our society and undo the structures that continue to benefit me at Sharon's expense.
Tom and Sharon, I'm so sad we've come to the end of our time because I feel like we could talk all night with you. Thank you so much for sharing so honestly about your journey. It's been wonderful, and I want to thank the audience for the wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but this has just been so meaningful. And thank you to everyone.
You should probably tell people this conversation was recorded and it will be online on YouTube as a Beacon Press link, I'm assuming. So it will be available.
Yeah, and just huge thanks to Beacon Press. Support for our book, of course, but for all of the amazing, amazing books that you publish to help people be more aware of what's real and what needs to be done in our world. And so thanks for having Sharon and I on here today.
Here's the instruction. It will be recorded and it will be go to the Beacon Press page on Facebook. It will be there with a link.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.